the Middle East. A land of ancient history, vibrant cultures and simmering tensions. For decades, it has been a powder keg, a place where even the smallest spark could ignite a conflagration. At the heart of this volatile region lies the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a seemingly intractable struggle that has fueled resentment, fear and violence for generations. Despite numerous attempts at peace, the two sides remain locked in a bitter stalemate, their destinies intertwined in a deadly embrace. The year is 2024. The world has watched with growing unease as the situation in the Middle East deteriorates. Extremist rhetoric has reached fever pitch. Trust between Israelis and Palestinians has eroded to the point of no return. The international community, preoccupied with its own problems, has failed to address the underlying causes of the conflict. Warnings from diplomats and peace activists have gone unheeded. Now, the drums of war beat louder than ever. A sense of foreboding hangs heavy in the air, a premonition of the catastrophe that awaits. The stage is set for a conflict that will shake the very foundations of the region and send shockwaves across the globe. August 1st, 2024, a day that will live in infamy. A series of escalating border clashes between Israeli forces and Palestinian militants in Gaza sets in motion a chain reaction that will have devastating consequences. What begins as a localized exchange of fire quickly spirals out of control, fueled by years of pent-up anger, mistrust and a thirst for revenge. The fragile peace that has held for so long shatters into a million pieces. Both sides dig in, convinced that this is a fight for survival. The conflict takes on a momentum of its own, dragging in neighboring countries and plunging the region into chaos. Fear and hatred spread like wildfire, consuming all in their path. Leaders on both sides, under immense pressure from their own populations, resort to increasingly desperate measures. The situation on the ground deteriorates rapidly as civilians are caught in the crossfire. As the violence escalates, the international community watches with a mixture of horror and impotence. The United Nations calls for an immediate ceasefire, but its pleas fall on deaf ears. The United States, long a staunch ally of Israel, finds itself caught between its commitments and the growing international outcry against the escalating violence.
Russia, eager to assert its influence in the region, seizes the opportunity to challenge American hegemony. China, too, watches with keen interest, sensing an opportunity to advance its own strategic interests.
The world holds its breath, bracing itself for the unthinkable. The conflict in the Middle East has become a global crisis, threatening to engulf the entire world in flames. The Gaza Strip, a densely populated sliver of land on the Mediterranean coast, becomes the epicenter of the conflict. Israeli warplanes, armed with precision-guided munitions, unleash a relentless bombardment on suspected Hamas targets. Buildings crumble into dust. Streets transform into rivers of rubble. The air grows thick with smoke and the stench of death. On the ground, Israeli defense forces push into Gaza, encountering fierce resistance from Hamas fighters. Skirmishes erupt in crowded urban areas, turning neighborhoods into battlefields. Civilians trapped in their homes cower in terror as rockets streak overhead and explosions shake the very foundations of their world.
Hospitals, overwhelmed by the influx of casualties, struggle to cope. Medical supplies dwindle with each passing hour. Doctors and nurses, working tirelessly amidst the carnage, are forced to make impossible choices, deciding who lives and who dies.
Section 2. A spreading conflagration. The conflict, once confined to Gaza, begins to spread like wildfire. Hezbollah, the powerful Shiite militia based in Lebanon, launches a barrage of rockets into northern Israel, targeting strategic installations and civilian population centers. The skies above Haifa and other Israeli cities light up with the fiery trails of incoming missiles. Meanwhile, in Syria, various militant groups, some with ties to Iran, join the fray, opening up a new front in the conflict. The Golan Heights, a strategic plateau captured by Israel in 1967, becomes a battleground once again. The Syrian government, weakened by years of civil war, struggles to maintain control as the country teeters on the brink of collapse. As the fighting intensifies, fears of a wider regional war grow with each passing day. Jordan and Egypt, both with peace treaties with Israel, find themselves caught in the middle. Torn between their obligations and the overwhelming pressure from their own citizens, many of whom sympathize with the Palestinian cause. Section 3. The Fog of War. In the chaotic fog of war, truth becomes a casualty. Propaganda and misinformation spread like wildfire, fueled by social media and partisan news outlets. Each side demonizes the other, portraying themselves as victims and their enemies as ruthless aggressors. The international community, struggling to make sense of the rapidly evolving situation, finds itself paralyzed by indecision. Diplomatic efforts to broker a ceasefire flounder as each side refuses to back down. The United Nations, its credibility already tarnished by past failures, seems powerless to stop the bloodshed. As the days turn into nights, the violence shows no signs of abating. The world watches in horror as the Middle East, once a cradle of civilization, descends into an abyss of violence and despair. Section 1. The 11th Hour. By August 10th, the situation in Israel has become dire. The relentless bombardment from Hezbollah and Palestinian militants has taken a heavy toll. Key infrastructure lies in ruins. Cities, once vibrant hubs of life, are now scarred battlefields. Hospitals, overflowing with the wounded and dying, face dwindling supplies and exhausted staff. The Israeli government, facing mounting pressure from a terrified populace, convenes for an emergency session. The air crackles with tension as military leaders present a grim assessment of the situation. Their defenses are stretched thin. Casualties continue to mount. Intelligence reports warn of a massive, coordinated attack in the coming days.
The unthinkable is now on the table, the nuclear option. Debate rages within the fortified bunker. Hawks argue for a decisive strike, a show of force that will cripple their enemies and bring a swift end to the conflict. Doves plead for restraint, warning of catastrophic consequences that could engulf the entire region in flames.
Section 2. A shadow falls over Gaza. The decision is made. At dawn, under a sky heavy with smoke and foreboding, an Israeli fighter jet takes off from a heavily guarded airbase. It carries a payload that has the power to reshape the world. The target, Gaza City, the densely populated heart of the Palestinian territories. Minutes later, a blinding flash illuminates the sky over Gaza. A mushroom cloud, its edges glowing an eerie orange, climbs into the heavens, casting a long, dark shadow over the city below. The ground trembles violently. Buildings crumble into dust. A shockwave, traveling faster than sound, races outwards, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. In the blink of an eye, Gaza City is transformed into a vision of hell on earth. Tens of thousands are vaporized instantly. Those on the periphery of the blast face a slower, more agonizing death from radiation sickness. Hospitals, already overwhelmed by the conventional fighting, are simply vaporized, along with their patients and staff. Section 3. The world reels. News of the nuclear strike sends shockwaves across the globe. In living rooms, offices and streets around the world, people stare in disbelief at the images flashing across their screens. The unthinkable has happened. A nuclear weapon has been detonated in anger for the first time since 1945. Condemnation is swift and universal. The United Nations convenes for an emergency session, but the atmosphere is one of utter paralysis. The world's most powerful nations, once eager to assert their dominance, now find themselves on the precipice of a global catastrophe of their own making.
Fear and uncertainty grip the world. Stock markets crash. Borders are closed. Governments scramble to assess the situation and formulate a response. But the truth is, no one knows what will happen next. The world is holding its breath, bracing itself for the fallout, both literal and figurative, of this apocalyptic act.
Section 1. The Fury of 1,000 Suns. Across the Middle East, a collective gasp of horror gives way to a roar of outrage. The images from Gaza, beamed around the world by satellite, are seared into the minds of millions. The use of nuclear weapons, a taboo that had held for nearly a century, has been shattered. And with it, the fragile peace that had existed, however tenuously, between Israel and its neighbours. In Tehran, the streets erupt in fury. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader, his face a mask of barely contained rage, appears on state television. His words, translated into a dozen languages, echo across the globe, a chilling promise of retribution. He declares a holy war against Israel, vowing to wipe the Zionist entity off the map. Within hours, Iranian ballistic missiles, long prepared for this moment, are raining down on Israeli cities. Tel Aviv, Haifa, Jerusalem. All are targeted. Air raid sirens wail, but there is nowhere to hide from the fury of 1,000 suns. The sky is ablaze with fire. Buildings, once symbols of modernity and progress, are reduced to smouldering rubble. The Arab world, so often divided by internal conflicts and rivalries, finds unity in the face of this unspeakable act. From the bustling streets of Cairo to the opulent palaces of Riyadh, one message rings out: death to Israel. The Arab League, for once speaking with a single voice, condemns the nuclear attack in the strongest possible terms and calls for an immediate united response. Saudi Arabia, long a silent partner in the West's efforts to contain Iran, throws its full weight behind the Palestinian cause. Its vast oil reserves, the lifeblood of the global economy, are now a weapon to be wielded against Israel and its allies. The message is clear: support Israel and face economic ruin. Across the region, armies mobilize. Tanks rumble across the desert sands, their guns pointed towards Israel. Fighter jets scream through the skies, their pilots eager for revenge. A sense of righteous anger, fueled by generations of perceived injustice, sweeps through the Arab world, uniting people from all walks of life in a common cause. In Washington, the mood is one of shock and disbelief. The unthinkable has happened. An ally, a country that America has supported unconditionally for decades, has used nuclear weapons. The president, facing the most severe crisis of his presidency, struggles to formulate a coherent response. The country is deeply divided. On one side, pro-Israel groups, their voices amplified by powerful lobbying groups, demand unwavering support for Israel, arguing that it acted in self-defense. On the other side, a growing chorus of voices horrified by the carnage in Gaza calls for sanctions against Israel and an end to American military aid.
The president, caught between his loyalty to an old ally and the moral outrage of the international community, finds himself increasingly isolated. His decisions, whatever they may be, will have far-reaching consequences, not only for the Middle East, but for the future of the world. The world watches, holding its breath, as America, the self-proclaimed leader of the free world, grapples with a crisis that threatens to tear it apart.
The nuclear blast in Gaza City becomes a global flashpoint, igniting long-simmering tensions and pushing the world closer to the brink of a global conflict. The carefully constructed facade of international diplomacy crumbles as nations choose sides, driven by a mix of ideology, strategic interests, and raw fear. The United States, its credibility already tarnished by past interventions in the Middle East, finds itself caught in a maelstrom of its own making. Domestically, public opinion is sharply divided, with pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian groups clashing in the streets. Internationally, the condemnation is swift and unrelenting, with even America's closest allies expressing horror and disgust at the use of nuclear weapons.
The president, facing a barrage of criticism and threats of economic sanctions, struggles to maintain a semblance of control. His administration, deeply divided between hawks urging a full-fledged military intervention and doves advocating for diplomacy, appears paralyzed by indecision. Every move, every word is scrutinized by a global audience, each action carrying the weight of potentially catastrophic consequences.
As the United States grapples with its internal divisions, other global powers see an opportunity to advance their own agendas. Russia, eager to reassert its influence on the world stage and challenge American hegemony, throws its support behind the Arab coalition. Shipments of weapons and military advisors flow into Syria and Iran, bolstering their defenses and emboldening their resolve.
China, ever pragmatic and calculating, watches the unfolding chaos with a mixture of apprehension and opportunity. While publicly condemning the violence and calling for restraint, Beijing quietly increases its economic and diplomatic ties with Iran and other Arab states, sensing a chance to erode American influence in the energy-rich region.
The lines in the sand are drawn. The Middle East, once a battleground for regional powers, has become the epicenter of a new Cold War, a high-stakes chess game played by nations with nuclear arsenals and global ambitions. The world watches, holding its breath, as the risk of miscalculation, of a spark igniting a global conflagration, grows with each passing day. The spectre of a global nuclear conflict, a terrifying possibility that had haunted humanity for decades, re-emerges with chilling intensity. The carefully crafted safeguards of the Cold War era, the treaties and hotlines designed to prevent accidental escalation, seem woefully inadequate in the face of this new crisis. Military forces around the world are placed on high alert. Nuclear submarines, silent predators lurking beneath the waves, patrol strategic choke points, their missiles armed and ready. Early warning systems, a web of radars and satellites scanning the skies for signs of attack, operate at full capacity, their operators on edge, their fingers hovering over buttons that could unleash unimaginable destruction. The world holds its breath, trapped in a deadly game of chicken. Every bellicose statement from a world leader, every movement of troops and warships, every blip on a radar screen has the potential to trigger a chain reaction that could end in global annihilation. The fate of humanity hangs in the balance, a stark reminder of the fragility of peace and the ever-present danger of nuclear weapons. The nuclear firestorm that consumed Gaza City triggered a mass exodus unlike anything seen in modern history. Millions fleeing the invisible killer that stalked the ruins of their homes poured across borders into neighboring countries. A tide of humanity, driven by fear and desperation, surged into Egypt, Jordan and Lebanon, overwhelming border crossings and straining the resources of already struggling nations.
The lucky ones, those with some semblance of family ties or financial means, found refuge with relatives or secured passage on overcrowded boats bound for Europe. But for the vast majority, the journey was one of unimaginable hardship and despair. Families were separated in the chaos, their cries lost in the deafening roar of the crowd. The elderly and infirm, unable to keep up, collapsed by the roadside, their pleas for help drowned out by the shuffling feet of those desperate to escape the nightmare.
The roads leading out of Gaza, once bustling arteries of commerce and connection, transformed into nightmarish rivers of human misery. Under a scorching sun with little food, water or shelter, the refugees trudged onward, their bodies racked with exhaustion, their spirits broken by the horrors they had witnessed. Children, their eyes wide with terror, clung to their parents, their small voices whispering questions that no one could answer. The neighbouring Arab countries, already grappling with their own political and economic turmoil, struggled to cope with the sheer scale of the refugee crisis.
Jordan, its fragile infrastructure strained to the breaking point, opened its borders out of a sense of humanitarian obligation, but the influx of refugees threatened to overwhelm its already limited resources.
Lebanon, still bearing the scars of its own civil war and struggling to accommodate a large Palestinian refugee population from previous conflicts, found itself on the verge of collapse.
The government, its pleas for international aid largely ignored, warned of social unrest and the potential for the conflict to spill across its borders.
Egypt, facing its own internal challenges and wary of destabilizing its peace treaty with Israel, initially resisted opening its borders.
But the images of human suffering, broadcast around the world by a relentless media, proved impossible to ignore. Reluctantly, the government relented, allowing a limited number of refugees to cross the border into the Sinai Peninsula.
For those fleeing across the Mediterranean, the journey was fraught with peril.
Overcrowded and unseaworthy boats, crewed by smugglers more interested in profit than human life, set sail from clandestine ports along the coast, their human cargo crammed together like cattle.
Many never reached their destination. The lucky ones were intercepted by Coast Guard vessels or humanitarian ships, their occupants deposited, often traumatized and destitute, on the shores of Greece, Italy or Spain.
But for every boat that made it, countless others sank beneath the waves, their passengers swallowed by the unforgiving sea.
The Mediterranean, once a cradle of civilization, became a watery graveyard, a testament to the human cost of the conflict.
The world, bombarded with images of overcrowded lifeboats and the lifeless bodies of children washing ashore, watched in horror, its conscience shaken, but its ability to find a solution seemingly paralyzed.
The conflict in the Middle East, once a regional crisis, rapidly metastasized into a global economic catastrophe.
The gears of global commerce, so reliant on the steady flow of oil from the region, ground to a halt.
The price of crude oil, responding to the chaos and uncertainty, skyrocketed, shattering records and sending shockwaves through the global economy.
At gas stations across the globe, lines stretched for blocks as panicked motorists jockeyed for dwindling supplies. Prices soared, turning a routine fill-up into a major expense.
For the world's poor, the price hikes were catastrophic, pushing millions deeper into poverty and sparking food riots in countries already teetering on the brink.
The interconnectedness of the global economy, once touted as a symbol of progress and cooperation, became its Achilles heel.
Stock markets, reacting to the uncertainty and the spectre of a global recession, went into freefall. The Dow Jones, the Nasdaq, the Nikkei all plummeted, wiping out trillions of dollars in wealth and shattering investor confidence.
Governments, caught off guard by the speed and ferocity of the economic collapse, scrambled to respond. Emergency rate cuts, stimulus packages, bailouts, all were deployed in a desperate attempt to stave off the worst, but the measures seem woefully inadequate in the face of such an unprecedented crisis.
The manufacturing sector, heavily reliant on the energy sector and just-in-time supply chains, ground to a halt. Factories went dark, laying off millions of workers. The construction industry, already reeling from the rising cost of materials, went into a tailspin, leaving half-finished buildings as monuments to the shattered dreams of a bygone era.
The service sector, the engine of many developed economies, wasn't spared either. Tourism, once a booming industry, collapsed as people canceled travel plans and hunkered down at home. Restaurants and bars stood empty, their owners struggling to make rent. The retail sector, already grappling with the rise of online shopping, saw sales plummet as consumers tightened their belts and braced for an uncertain future.
The environmental consequences of the conflict, though less immediate than the human cost, were no less devastating. The nuclear detonation over Gaza City had released a plume of radioactive fallout into the atmosphere, casting a long shadow over the region. The prevailing winds carried the invisible killer eastward, contaminating vast swathes of land in Israel, Jordan, and beyond. Crops withered and died, their leaves turning a sickly yellow. Livestock exposed to the radiation developed tumors and birth defects. The once fertile lands of the Levant, the breadbasket of the Middle East, were transformed into a toxic wasteland. The contamination wasn't confined to the land. Rain carrying radioactive particles fell upon the Mediterranean Sea, entering the food chain and accumulating in fish and other marine life. Coastal communities, reliant on fishing for their livelihoods, faced a stark choice: abandon their homes and their way of life, or risk the long-term health consequences of consuming contaminated food. Section 4. A world transformed. The world in the space of a few short weeks had been irrevocably transformed. The old certainties, the belief in progress, the interconnectedness of the globalized world all lay shattered, victims of a conflict that had spiraled out of control. The nuclear shadow that had fallen upon Gaza City had darkened the skies of the entire planet. The world, once brimming with hope and possibility, now faced an uncertain future, haunted by the spectre of nuclear annihilation and the realization that the things that united humanity were fragile, easily broken by the forces of fear, hatred, and the insatiable thirst for power. In the aftermath of the unimaginable, amidst the ruins of a world on fire, a single question echoed. Could humanity rise from the ashes of its own destruction, learn from its mistakes and forge a new path, one based on peace, cooperation, and the understanding that we are all interconnected, our fates intertwined? The answer, like the future itself, remained shrouded in uncertainty. As August drew to a close, the world watched with bated breath, hoping against hope for a glimmer of light in the darkness. The relentless cycle of violence, the seemingly endless barrage of rockets and airstrikes, the heart-wrenching images of death and destruction. It seemed impossible to imagine an end to the nightmare, and yet, from the ashes of unimaginable suffering, a flicker of hope emerged. Exhausted, their resources depleted, their populations weary of war, both sides finally agreed to a ceasefire.
The agreement, brokered by the United Nations after weeks of tense negotiations, was fragile. A patchwork of compromises and concessions held together by the slimmest of threads. The guns fell silent. The skies, once filled with the roar of jets and the fiery trails of missiles, grew quiet. A strange and unsettling calm descended upon the land, a silence heavy with the weight of grief, the echoes of explosions, and the unspoken fear that it could all erupt again at any moment.
The ceasefire held, but the scars of August ran deep, etched into the landscape and the soul of the Middle East. Gaza, once a vibrant tapestry of life, lay in ruins, its streets littered with rubble, its buildings reduced to skeletal husks. The survivors, their faces etched with trauma, emerged from bomb shelters and makeshift underground hospitals, blinking in the sunlight, their world forever changed. In Israel, the physical damage was less severe, but the psychological wounds ran deep. The spectre of Iranian missiles, the fear that had gripped the nation during those long nights of bombardment, lingered in the air. The country, once a beacon of stability in a volatile region, now found itself grappling with a new reality, one in which its very existence felt precarious, its future uncertain.
The international community, its conscience shaken by the horrors it had witnessed, pledged billions in aid, promising to help rebuild the shattered lives and infrastructure of the region. But the task seemed overwhelming, the damage so vast, the wounds so deep, that it was difficult to imagine a time when the Middle East, the cradle of civilization, would ever fully heal.
The ceasefire marked not an end, but a beginning. The long and arduous task of rebuilding lay ahead, a journey fraught with challenges and fraught with the ever-present danger that the cycle of violence could erupt anew. The road to peace, always a difficult one, was now littered with the debris of war, the shattered remnants of trust, and the deep-seated animosity that had fueled the conflict for generations.
The underlying issues, the status of Jerusalem, the right of return for Palestinian refugees, the settlements in the West Bank, remained unresolved, ticking time bombs waiting to explode.
The world watched, its hopes tempered with a healthy dose of realism, knowing that the path ahead would be long, arduous, and fraught with peril. The ghosts of August, the memories of the horrors that had unfolded, served as a constant reminder of the fragility of peace and the urgent need to find a lasting solution, one that would allow both Israelis and Palestinians to live in security, dignity, and peace.